Hi, Nine. Welcome to your second lesson of your Stalin unit of work. Remember, we're asking here, was Stalin a great leader? And last lesson, we would have seen evidence that supported both sides of that argument. We saw how Stalin perhaps wasn't quite the natural choice for leadership. Lenin called him stupid. He didn't like him. In his testament, he said he did not want Stalin to be the leader of the party. And on top of that, Stalin actually used a lot of corruption, which again is something we might see as negative. On the flip side, however, Stalin had a lot of power. He was able to convince a lot of the Politburo, a lot of the State Duma to support him, and in the end, he actually did have the position that allowed him to be the leader of the Soviet Union. So last week we kind of did see a divide, and we looked at how Stalin comes to power. But that's only one very small part of our understanding of how Stalin's nation looks. So what we're going to do today is we're going to kind of build on what we did last week. We're going to try and answer this question directly now. Was Stalin a great leader? That is our overall inquiry. But part of understanding that question is to look at how he actually rules his nation. Now, this topic, I can imagine, is of interest to quite a few of you, and when we've taught this in the past, a lot of students have some really strong opinions about this lesson, about what the focus is. So let me just explain what the learning objective is for this lesson. We are going to understand the concept of communism, and we are going to evaluate its effectiveness and popularity. Now, communism is something really complicated, but it can be understood really easily. And by looking at how Stalin uses communism, we're going to, first of all, understand what that is to begin with, but then judge, is this something that works for Stalin? And does it make him a less or more popular dictator of the Soviet Union? So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to show you what your booklet should look like. So your booklet, your resource that I'll send out should look like this. So you can see we've got our title here and we've got our learning objective. Now the first thing I might want to do here is, actually let's get rid of that again. We've got that word evaluate. Now we had that last lesson. Now if you remember what that word is, then fantastic, but just as a reminder, evaluation, you can do this as I am, is about forming a judgment. We are trying to judge how effective this idea of communism actually is. Now, before we are able to do that, though, we need to start thinking about what we mean by effectiveness and popularity. So if something is effective for me, it's something that works, is something that achieves positive results, something that helps organize a country. They might be things that we see as effective. And with popularity, it's that basic definition, something that you'll see and you'll talk about every day anyway. How popular is this? Do people like it? Are they in favor of it? Or are they really against it? So now that I've added those brackets, the learning objective is a little bit more accessible for us. So we're understanding the concept of socialism, and we are judging whether communism works, achieves positive results, or helps organize a country, and whether it is popular. Do people like this? That's the focus of today's lesson. And what we can basically say is that if people do not like it, if it is not effective, if it doesn't work, if it doesn't achieve positive results, if it doesn't help organize a country, we might have a lot more evidence today to say that Stalin is not a great leader. If we find that actually it is effective, we see great results from this, we see a really organised nation, and we see that actually people love this idea of communism, that might be something that we can say is a lot more positive about Stalin. Now, before we get into having a look at communism, and again, I'm sure some of you have a lot of thoughts on that already, I'm just going to give you your first low stakes quiz. Now, again, do this exactly the same as you would any normal lesson. So I'm going to ask you to pause this for a few minutes, maybe 2 to 3, so that you can answer as many questions as possible. The way to do this, and you'll have the exact same document in front of you, if you just type your answer here, and I've just typed anything there, it shouldn't disrupt the table too much, and it should be really easy to format. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes there, so if you want to pause now, and then after that we can go through the answers together. Okay, so hopefully you have been able to answer those questions, and we are going to go through this now. Sorry, just bear with me for 1 second. I just want to check. Yep. Okay. That's fine. So, when was the first successful use of tanks? Now, some of you might have put the Battle of the Somme, because that was the first battle that we see tanks being used, but it is not actually a successful use of tanks. The successful use of tanks took place at the Battle of Cambrai. Number 2, what was the cause of trench foot? That is, of course, waterlogged trenches. So soldiers would walk in them frequently, make them prone to infection, and they would swell, and they would be incredibly unpleasant. Which war did Russia fight in 1905 and 1906? This was the Russo-Japanese War. If you remember correctly, Tsar Nicholas got a lot of criticism for this war because they were embarrassed, and so the Russians were embarrassed, and it wasn't very good because the way that the war had been portrayed to people was that the Japanese were inferior. They didn't quite have the military power that Russia did, and actually they ended up being victorious. What did Lenin's testament state? Well, Lenin's testament stated that Stalin was not the desired leader of the Soviet Union. You would have seen that from last week. And where was Trotsky exiled to? So Trotsky was exiled to Kazakhstan. So if you've got all of those right, then what you can do is you can maybe just give a dash to show that you got that mark, maybe an X if you did not. But again, you should always be correcting yourself on these, so make sure that if you didn't have the right answer to begin with, you do have it now. Okay, so let's move on. So you have got this quote in front of you. Now, I'm not going to read it out to you first. Again, I want you to do as much of this as you can away from me telling you. I just want you to spend a couple of minutes, maybe pause this video. Now, this is the decree on land, and this is something that is seen as a communist law. Now, again, some of you might be coming in with prior knowledge, but this quote and this law is going to really help us understand what communism actually is. So what I want you to do, and again, this will be really helpful for you guys, pause the video here. I want you to read through independently first, and I want you to jot down any thoughts that you might have or any ideas that you have about what communism actually is. And again, you can do this here. Just bear in mind, if you type, it will move the line. So what you might want to do is just enter a few times, go back up, and you can write some thoughts here, maybe in bullet points. So again, give the video a pause, and I'm going to give you a few minutes to read through that independently, and then I'm going to feedback what my thoughts are on this. Okay, so hopefully you have had some time to focus on that. One of the conversations that I have with my classes, and again, this is so frustrating that we're doing this through videos because I like to have a lot of discussions with my class about this. I think it's a really interesting thing to talk about, this idea of communism, because we in this country are not a communist nation. We are a capitalist nation. And that means that people are able to make money. They're able to make money off of other people's labor. So for instance, if you might have somebody at home, so my dad is a plumber, and while my dad earns his wages doing his plumbing, his boss earns money off of the work that my dad does too. Now that's capitalism. It means that that person is able to move labor or move workers, and those workers are able to make that person money. Capitalism is also about private ownership of land. So for instance, your family might own their house, or that's kind of a small example. If we go even further, there are people that own land where industry is. There are people that own land of natural beauty. And again, those lands are used to build profit. Everyone is incentivized in this country because it is capitalist to earn as much money as they can. Now, for some of us, that might be like, well, yeah, of course. What else would you do if you weren't trying to earn as much money as possible? Well, this is where we get the other side, and this is communism. And hopefully you've been able to see through this quote exactly, or not exactly, but some insight into what communism actually is. So let's go through this together. I'm going to highlight a couple of things that I think are really important. So, decree on land. Private ownership of land shall be abolished forever. Now, straight away, that is a stark contrast to the capitalism that we expect in this country. What that's basically saying is that nobody should own land privately. And let's keep reading. So, land shall not be sold, purchased, or mortgaged. All land, whether state, crown, church, or factory, shall be confiscated without compensation and become the property of the people. Again, this is really interesting because in this country, the church does own a lot of land. In this country, our monarchy, the Queen, owns a lot of land. Industrialists, so factory owners, own a lot of land. But in a communist country, it's saying that that land should be taken away and that land should be given to the people. So one word that comes out of this for me is sharing. This is all about sharing what is there for the people. It's about making sure that everybody has an equal share of the land that is there and that it isn't under private ownership. It is in fact owned, and it's this point here, owned by the people. Now again, this is very, very different because when we go to, so I'll use my example, I'm a teacher. When I go to Joe Richardson Community School to teach, I am not somebody that can say that that land is my property. Even though I am the people, that land is not my property. In this country, that land is state property. That is the opposite of what this law is saying. This law is saying that actually that land shouldn't be owned by the state. That school land where Joe Richardson is shouldn't be state property. It should become the property of the people. Now, we can start to work out how communism then might be very different from capitalism. It's about banning private ownership. It's about taking land away from the state, from the crown, from the church, from factory owners, from industrialists. And it's about giving that to the people. You might have heard the phrase, and some of you that have done your research might have done too, to seize the means of production. That is essentially what the decree on land is. People being able to take the land for themselves and use the land to contribute to the state. Now, I'm going to explain what that means a bit further, but here's what I want you to do. I know that that's a very difficult question to answer. I know it's even more difficult because I'm not there with you in a classroom and we're not having this discussion. But here's what I've done to help you as much as I can. If you have your PowerPoint, and I've got this on the video anyway, I've given you a definition of communism that I think suits our lesson for today. So this is my definition. Communism is a theory or system of social organisation in which all property is owned by the community and each person contributes and receives according to their ability and needs. So it isn't about one person owning quite a lot of land or quite a lot of industry and taking money from those workers. It's about those workers actually all owning that property and being able to take what they need from that in terms of money, in terms of resources. So it's a very different system to capitalism. Now, what I'm going to recommend is that you pause here, and if you didn't get a definition down, which is fine, it's a really difficult concept, and it's even more difficult to do through online learning, I want you to get this definition down in that space that we saw in our booklet, because I think that will really help you guys, or on your worksheet, sorry. What I would also recommend, and you can do this now, so you can pause the video now, have another tab open on YouTube and have a look through what some people have said about communism. I can only really take so much of your time up with this video, but this is an avenue that you can explore on your own independently. What does communism look like? What does it look like in other countries? And if you do decide to do that, it will really help you with your next activity that we're going to do together anyway. So I'm going to give you a chance to pause here, get that definition down. That definitely needs to be done. If you don't have a definition of your own, I want this definition in your worksheets. And then if you want to watch some videos, have another YouTube tab open, totally fine, and then we can come back and we can look at our next activity. So I'm going to leave that there now, a couple of minutes, and then we're going to come back. Okay, fantastic. Hopefully you've got that definition down, and hopefully quite a lot of you have actually gone on to do a little bit of extra research on what communism is. Again, always a good idea, something that's always going to help you to go that extra step beyond. Now, remember what our objective is here. This is only kind of half of what we're supposed to be doing here. Understand the concept of communism and evaluate its effectiveness and popularity. So we've understood the concept. This bit, I think we've got a good understanding here. If this is our definition moving forward, fantastic. But now we need to see, well, has Stalin used it effectively? Do people like it? Has it worked? Now, what some of you might see, I'm going to get the worksheet open here again, is that there is an extension question here to ask whether the United Kingdom is a communist country. Now, we spoke about that already. If you want to add some details there, fantastic. I definitely recommend it. But this is just an extension. What we need to do next is we need to see, okay, where are the positives of communism and where are the negatives? And we need to number them in terms of importance. So first of all, let's just read through this so that we know exactly what's going on here. We understand communism. Now it's about making those judgments we mentioned earlier with our learning objectives. So, the Soviet Union is seen as the world's first experiment with communism, and therefore is an interesting case study for many political and historical researchers. Based on your understanding of communism, you should have some idea of whether you do or do not think this political system is fair. So some of you might be, and what I usually do is I'll explain how communism might mean that somebody in one room might have £10 and somebody in the same room might have £1. Under communism, that is averaged out so that each person has £5. Now, some of you might say, well, good, fantastic, that's really fair, because what that shows is that everybody has an equal share. But then other people argue, well, actually, I don't think that is fair because he's gone into that room with £10. Why on earth should his money be taken to help somebody else? And again, totally valid explanations on both sides. But if you're not sure on your judgment, this activity is really going to help you form that evaluation. And it's to do this. You are going to colour code them. So the way to do this, and you can do this on Word very easily, you've already seen me use highlight here. If you go up and click on Home, you can see that I've got the highlight tool here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight positive in one colour, so that is the yellow. I'm then going to change colour, and let's change it to pink, and that is going to be my negative of communism. So maybe let's do that first so that we can understand exactly how to do this. So, like I said, some of you will already think communism maybe is a fairer way to run a country. Some of you might be thinking, actually, I don't think it's fair on the people that have more money that it's taken away. Remember that quote at the beginning? All land should be confiscated without compensation. Is it fair that factory owners lose their land without having any compensation? Again, this is something that you can be debating. So let's have a look at what the evidence says. And we've got, so this is where I'd ask someone to pick a number, but obviously I don't have that privilege. So let's just start with the first one. Communism has a centrally planned economy. What that means is that the way that money or the way that industry is organised, it all comes from the government. So it says here, this means the government is in control. It can quickly organise large economic projects and create industrial power. Okay, so we've got to think here, is this a positive of communism? Is it a negative? So I'm going to look at the language, and I can see here, it can quickly organise large economic projects. Now that for me is something very positive, because if it can be done quickly, it means money can be made quickly. And if it's large economic projects that create industrial power, then fantastic. That means that we're earning more money and we're able to do this on a massive scale because it's all planned centrally by the government. For me, this is a positive. However, and again, this is where those that want to push themselves, I think they really can start to get their political minds thinking. You've got to start to think about what that might mean for the individual. So if the government are controlling everything, it means that maybe some businessmen, some industrialists, some thinkers might not have the freedom to do what they want to do. So while it's great that this creates fantastic economic projects, great industrial power, it doesn't allow personal freedom. It doesn't allow industrialists to be creative in the market. If you look at somebody, so if we were to look at, Steve Jobs or Elon Musk, they've been able to make their money and to create an industry because they've been allowed that freedom of creativity. Elon Musk has been able to create Tesla and do things that haven't been controlled by the government. You could argue that those discoveries or those inventions are never made if it is all controlled by the government. So you might, and again, it's entirely up to your thoughts here, I might just say that the fact it is the government in control might not necessarily be a positive thing. I'm going to go through one more together with you, and I am going to go through, which one should I go through? I'm going to go to the box here. So bottom left-hand box. It says here, in communist countries, the gap between the rich and the poor is almost non-existent. This means that there is no conflict between rich and poor and less inequality. However, it also means things like poverty affect everyone. Again, a really interesting point here, and I think some of you will already start to see how that language might be quite might indicate whether this is a positive or a negative. So let's think about the first one. So the gap between the rich and the poor is almost non-existent. Now, and again, this is why this lesson is so interesting. It's all about here our political opinions, all about your political opinions, I should say. Here's the way that I see this box in particular, and whether I see it as a positive or a negative. If the gap between the rich and the poor is almost non-existent and there is no conflict between rich and poor, that for me suggests that things are going quite positively, because look what it says here. There is less inequality. So I'm going to get my positive colour and I'm going to say, well, if there's less inequality, this must be something that is quite positive. No conflict, less inequality. The gap is non-existent. These are all things that are positive because it shows that everybody is equal. But then we can see maybe the negative side of that. And while equality is something we all want to achieve, when it comes to economics, if everybody is economically equal, if, say, a famine happens or if a depression, so an economic depression takes place, if a country loses money, that doesn't just affect one part of the country. If everybody is equal in terms of economics, that affects everybody. And this might be one of the consequences of having a communist system that isn't so positive. Things like poverty are devastating for everyone. And again, that for me is something that I might consider negative. That is your first job here, to make sure that you are identifying the positives and the negatives of communism, because remember, our objective is all about evaluating whether it is effective and popular. Now, your second activity, and there are two that I want you to do here. As much as we've said that there are positives and negatives, some of these positives might actually outweigh the negatives, or some of these negatives might outweigh the positives. So let's use the two examples I've said here. I've said that the negatives are that the government is in control, which might limit freedom, and that everyone might be affected by poverty. Now, I could decide that actually, even though they are quite negative things, I think the positives outweigh those negative things. So what I mean by that is the fact that there is no conflict and things are more equal is something that is good enough, something that is such a good positive that this idea of poverty affecting everybody isn't actually that big of a negative. If everybody is equal, then that might be a priority. And again, this is why it's all based on your opinion. So what I want you to do is informed opinion based on the evidence. So not only are you going to color code positive and negative, I also want you to number each of these points in terms of importance. So for instance, I might say, well, if we've got this gap between the rich and the poor and everyone's equal, I might consider that my most important. So I might label that number 1. And again, just by clicking and typing the number, you should be able to do that. 2 jobs there: highlight the negative, highlight the positive. Again, pause the video here and work your way through that. And after you've done that, we're going to start to make some judgments. We're going to start to put this all together and form our answer to this big question. Okay, pause here and we'll feed back in a moment. Okay, so I am hoping that that table is now complete, that we've got our positives, that we have our negatives, and just some interesting things that I want to draw out before we move on and before we kind of make that final judgment. I want you to have a look at some of these points in a bit more detail. So for instance, we've already spoken through 2 of these, but if we see here, communism is always looking to improve the conditions of society. So again, you might see that as a positive and you might have already got that down. But we can see that sometimes looking to do that in this time period is impossible because the USSR is the only communist country. Again, these are all things that require you to form a judgment here. And I'm not going to go through every single one. That's not what these lessons are supposed to be. It's not supposed to be me just giving you the answers. But I'm hoping that we've got a clear judgment here on whether we think this is or is not an effective way to run the country. And this is where we come to our final. So ignore that because you won't be sent this today. This is where I want you to start to make that final judgment. We know what communism is. And in fact, actually, if we look at our success criteria, we have defined communism. We know now that communism is about abolishing private ownership of land and giving that land to the people. It's about an equal share for the people, not private ownership by state, crown, church, or industrialist. We know some of the positives and the negatives here. We know that the positives include free healthcare for everybody, lower classes being having their conditions improved, economic output. But we also know the negatives. We know that people maybe aren't quite as free in a communist state. We know that actually everybody will go through poverty. We know that a communist state is quite isolated in terms of the USSR. Now we need to make that final judgment. How far do we believe communism is an effective method of government? And again, not only are you going to use the evidence, but you're going to use your thoughts here. So this is the activity. Based on your understanding of communism and its positives and negatives, you need to decide whether you think this is an effective or popular way to rule the Soviet Union. Now, these are three things that I want you to consider. First of all, what is your opinion of communism? Do you think communism is fair? Is it fair that these industrialists have their land taken away and are not compensated? Is it fair that everybody has an equal share in society? Again, I don't want to guide your thoughts on that. I want you to make your judgment on that independently. Do you think the Russian people would support communism? Again, think about what you've seen here, a lack of freedom. Think about, okay, well, universal healthcare. There's two sides to this coin. I want you to see if you can form that judgment. And then finally, and this is kind of, I'm going to actually see this as a bit of a challenge one here. Do you think it matters if communism is popular, if it is effective? Now, this is a really high level way to consider communism. A lot of communist leaders don't actually care if it's popular. They only really care about the effectiveness of that political ideology. Now, I'm going to show you how I might structure this on my worksheet, because you've got a space to do this in your worksheet here. So, I am going to hit enter again so that these lines go down, and I'm going to start to answer my question. So first of all, let's think about what I'm asked to do here. Opinion: do I think Russian people will support it? Does it matter if people support it? I would recommend following the structure of although, nevertheless. And I'm going to show you how that looks. I don't want you to copy my answer down here. This is just to show you how I might do this. So I might say here, although communism took away the property of industrialists in Russia, nevertheless, it was an ideology that promoted equality and created powerful industry. Now that is just my kind of opening sentence here. And again, you might disagree with that. You might think, well, actually, so my although here, I'm saying, yeah, okay, I understand why it's negative. However, despite those negatives, it still did all of these positive things. I might then say here, well, for example, and again, I might go back up to my table just to double check. I can say, well, where can I see that equality? Here we go. Communism is concerned with the welfare of the population. Countries would look to provide free healthcare, education, and travel. So I might say here, for example, all citizens would receive, and again, I would just finish off that example there. Again, and this is where this starts to look really, this is basically your evidence. This is when it starts to look a little bit like a petal paragraph. This meant that. Again, include some judgments here. Well, this meant that. I might say if all citizens receive healthcare, received free travel, this meant that equality in communist countries was, how can I word that? So equality in communist countries was a high priority that led to a clear removal of hierarchy. Everyone was deemed equal, and as a result, this may have led to a support for a communist country, particularly amongst the lower classes. Now again, this is just my example. I definitely don't want you to copy this. And again, I haven't even done, this is just a very simple one. I haven't done most of these things. I haven't really given my opinion of communism. I haven't answered whether or not the Russian people would support communism. And I haven't answered this, and again, this question is such a high-thinking question here. Does it matter if communism is popular, if it's effective? I want you to kind of go above and beyond the example that I've just set out here, because this is very, very foundation level. I've given you a platform for you to move off it. I've only really used one example. Have a look through and really carefully think about where your evaluation is going to sit here, where your weight of your judgment will be. Because I think this is an incredibly important part, not just of understanding Stalin and Russia, but of understanding history in general. Right, I'm going to ask you to pause there. I'm going to give you 10 minutes to complete that. So give it a pause, and then after that, and I promise it'll only be a couple more minutes, we'll look through our final thoughts on this lesson. So 10 minutes, and then we'll come back. Okay, fantastic. So hopefully you have gone through this lesson, and something that was quite a scary, quite a big ideology to focus on here has been understood. And actually we've got an opinion, an opinion on it now, a judgment made of it. Now here's what we need to do finally. That's it in terms of the lesson content, but if you remember, we have our table here. And this is the table that you would have got last week with your previous documents. And you're going to constantly be updating that. So you can still edit that document now. We need to think about what our judgments are here. Where do we see Stalin as a great leader and not a great leader? So this is almost like our plenary here. And what I've done for you to make this as straightforward as possible is I've given you a couple of examples of where I think Stalin can be seen as a great leader, where I think he can be seen as not a great leader. Now this is not comprehensive, and you should be able to add a few more points here, but I've said this. The fact that in 1940, the USSR produced 120 million tons of more coal than at the start of Stalin's reign is a indicator that Stalin might be a great leader. On top of that, I've said if it's creating a fair and equal society, I also think that is something that shows he is a great leader. However, on the other side, Stalin took land away from those who owned it without any compensation. He couldn't be opposed by people because Stalin was not voted in, so part of communism is that democracy is removed, and you would have seen that from your table. And then finally, famine and poverty were felt by everybody under a communist regime. So these might be examples that you say show that actually Stalin isn't a great leader. But again, we've got two sides of the coin here, and you should be able to use everything you've seen today to complete parts of that table. Remember, you got this document last week, and you'll have to reopen that to add those different points there, and we'll be checking that through the Teams app. Once you've done that, and again, I'm going to leave it there, we are done looking at communism. Again, I'm really disappointed that I can't teach this in lessons, but this is as close as we can get to the real thing. I hope you're enjoying it, and I hope you're really starting to maybe even go beyond and start to do your own research. Thank you very much for watching this video, and thank you very much for keeping on top of your lessons. Please make sure you are doing so, just so that you are up to speed with exactly where you would be if we were still in school. Right, have a good week, Year 9, and I will be back next week with your next lesson. Thank you.